So you want to play Wizard. Of course, of course. But why should you listen to me? Well, I played Wizard exclusively during the last playtest, so here are some receipts. For those of you who are more of the,
Hi there. Is there a project you're working on? I know more than you.
kind of individual, timestamps in the description. For everyone else, feel free to kick back, grab a snack, and let's increase our knowledge. To begin our journey of increasing our knowledge, we'll start with the basics. Standard WSD plus mouse to move around and aim our character, tab to open our inventories, and right-click items to quickly move them to our pockets. We press X to sheath our active weapon to increase our movement speed when fleeing or if we need to move quickly. 3 and 4 to cycle through our utility columns, respectively, for the left and right, which we use for prepping for fights and cycling through our meds. Specifically for wizards, the default keybinds for spell usage will be the E key to open up the radio wheel for your spell memory. And then you hover your mouse in the region for the spell, and then release the E key. After that, as long as you have a spell focus in your hands, you can hold right mouse button down to charge up the spell, and once fully charged, let go of it to cast. Q will be your default for the meditations skill to gain charges of your spells back, both of which are essentially mandatory to take unless you're doing a hipster build. Now that we know how to select and how to cast spells, let's go over how to choose from the variety to even begin with. In the December playtest, the Iron Mace devs added a mechanic where you can actually pick and choose from a variety of spells to utilize up to a max selection of 5 spells if you're doing the standard wizard build. From those 5, another mechanic was added called Spell Memory Priority, where based on your knowledge threshold, your wizard remembers being able to use increasing amounts of your selected spells. Let's quickly go over what spells exist in this current point in development. First off, we have the spells that are in the 1-cost category. First we have Zap, which reads, if hit, deals magic damage and burns the target for 1 second. This spell is fantastic for dealing with small and or mobile PvE throughout the dungeon, such as the flying skulls and dragonfly enemies that can be troublesome to deal with, especially as a low-geared wizard. Next, we have the Light Orb. It blows up spheres of floating light to briefly illuminate the surroundings. Personally, I never really utilize this spell, as turning up the in-game brightness or using a torch is sufficient, and we don't want to waste a valuable spell slot just for a bit more light. Next we have Ignite, which reads, sets the target's weapon on fire, dealing 5 additional magic damage and burning enemies when they hit. This spell is practically mandatory for how good it is. For the cost of just 1 knowledge, it recharges from meditation very quickly, provides a great avenue for making wizards potent at clearing PvE efficiently, and if you want, lets you lean into the stealth dagger gameplay that was a big meta during the second playtest, but more on that later. Overall, phenomenal pick. I would only drop this if you aren't planning on taking a melee weapon with you into the dungeon. Alright, that wraps up the 1-cost category. Let's start off with the first spell in the 2-cost section. Slow. As the name implies, we slow the target's movement speed by minus 40% for 2.5 seconds. The spell was actually a default spell in older playtests, and personally, while it didn't make it into my preferred set of spells, it can be useful in niche situations to help you counter certain situations like a fighter using their sprint ability, or any kind of frontliner getting speed buffs from their allies, such as another enemy wizard. Next, we have Ice Bolt. Ice Bolt fires an ice projectile that, on hit, deals magic damage and reduces the target's movement speed by 15% for 1 second. On paper, this spell looks like a more damage-focused version of the slow spell, but oftentimes it didn't do enough damage for me to justify using it in my lineup. It filled the same niche as Zap for me to either take out mobile weak targets or supplement damage in when Fireball or Magic Missile was tapped out. And now we're getting into the bread and butter of what makes Wizards stand out at the 3-cost spells. And we start with Magic Missile. Fires up to 10 homing missiles that deal 12 damage each. Stops firing when you move. This spell is the be careful who you call ugly spells out of this list. A level 1 with no gear, it's still great, but once you get a sizable amount of cast speed, you turn into a roaming A10 gunner just waiting to burn some unsuspecting enemies. I will never enter the dungeon without this spell, as it's the best spell for low risk PvE, and it has phenomenal uses in PvP. Magic Missile not only scales off of cast speed by just being able to channel the spell originally faster, but also when firing the projectiles, it finishes the spell even faster. so you can output more of your magic missiles within a shorter period of time, leading to higher DPS. Right, next on our 3-cost spell list, we have Haste. Target gains a 14% action speed and movement speed bonus for 12 seconds. It casts itself if no other target is found. Overall, this is my personal favorite utility spell in the Wizard's repertoire. Just an amazing spell that, in my opinion, you should always have at your disposal. The movement speed alone is paramount when playing solo squads to allow yourself breathing room to maintain space between your enemies and for chasing and fleeing as the need calls for it. Alrighty. At 4 cost, we have Lightning Strike. After 4 seconds, a bolt of lightning falls in the targeted area, dealing spell damage. To be honest, I don't really know why this spell even exists. It does similar damage to Fireball without the damage over time that Fireball offers, and it has a huge setup time that in most situations you won't find yourself capable of pulling it off. If you want to play a hipster build, go for it. Otherwise, I recommend just steering clear from this one. And now we have Invisibility. Target becomes invisible and gains a 10% movement speed bonus for 4 seconds. This spell, again, is always in my lineup just for the sheer number of plays and tactics that you can use with this spell. Gathering information around blind corners, dropping monster aggro off of you whenever you cloak, using it to ambush players, using it to misdirect enemies in a fight, using it to slip into the enemy's backline, casting it on low health allies to let them reposition, casting it on your frontliners to let them pop up in the face of the enemies, and more. Paired with the perk that benefits your arcane spells, Invisibility is an arcane spell according to the devs Discord, becomes a powerhouse, and you'd be hurting yourself and any teammates that you're grouping up with by not taking this spell to help them out. And last but not least, we have Fireball. Self-explanatory, we know what this is. The 30 direct damage and 20 splash damage knockback spell that is known across all fantasy magic universes as being the good. In this game, it's alright at PvE, but boy does it do some serious heavy lifting in PvP. You can blast through debris and doors to clear a path as you're chasing someone, and the perks that increase the damage over time just pushes this spell into war crime territory. My personal favorite PvP spell, I try to never go anywhere in the dungeon without at least a couple charges at the ready. And at the end of our spell list, at least for now, we have the only 6-cost spell being Chain Lightning. It electrocutes the target, inflicting spell damage, and fires lightning that is transferred to a being within, it says 400 meters. In practice, this is more like 4 meters, and shocks up to 3 times. It doesn't chain to a target multiple times, and can hurt you if you're danger close. For this spell, you have to sacrifice a lot of other spells, or at least have a lot of knowledge on your gear to bring it up to full to have actual spell selection available. Personally, I find it interchangeable with Fireball, especially if you have the knowledge to support it. Fireball being a better well-rounded spell during most fights, while Chain Lightning is more niche. If you ever use this in group play, and you damage and kill your allies, just know that I'm warning you now of the Discord arguments that may come. If used correctly, this spell decimates opponents. Just be careful where you point this thing, especially if the enemy gets right up on you. Now that we know all the spells available to us, let's go over all the perks and skills, and which ones that I would recommend, along with the setup that I personally choose for my wizard. In order, we'll start with Arcane Feedback. Each time that you do damage with an arcane spell, your spellcasting speed and base magic damage increases by 1% per stack. Arcane Feedback can stack up to 5 times at once. The bonus duration lasts for 7 seconds and resets with each successful stack. At this point in time, this perk is exclusively beneficial for Magic Missile, as it's the only arcane damaging spell. In practice, this perk can essentially be quantified as a 5% cast speed and a 5% damage bonus, occasionally being online if you're meeting the conditions of hitting enemies with your Magic Missiles. If you're a Magic Missile enthusiast, it could be a good pick, but is often dominated by the next perk in my eyes, which is Arcane Mastery. Similar to our previous perk, this one provides an innate 5% damage bonus and 1 second reduction on cast time for arcane spells. The spells in this category are Arcane Missile and Invisibility, which greatly benefits our offensive and defensive capabilities if we utilize both of these spells. I personally include this perk with my lineup as the flat reduction in casting time combined with faster casting eventually lets you cast spells like this. Next, we have Fire Mastery. It increases the magic damage of the fire spells damaged by 5% and increases the duration of burn status by 2.5. If you're including Fireball and or Ignite in your spell list, this is practically mandatory just because of how good it is. If you're taking Chain Lightning as your primary PvP spell, you can skip this one. I include this perk in my lineup as well. Next, we have Ice Shield. Ice Shield increases the armor rating by 20 and inflicts Frostbite on melee attacker targets for 0.5 seconds. The armor bonus could be beneficial if you want to take more punishment from mobs or players, but the 20 armor won't really make that big of a difference, and it typically, if you're getting hit with melee attacks as a wizard, you're practically going to be dying soon or have to go back to the lobby. And the movement speed debuff won't have very much value because you're practically trying to avoid getting hit in the first place. Next, we have Reactive Shield. Similar vein to the previous perk, this activates an Arcane Reactive Shield that lasts for 3 seconds when you take damage. It's a bubble that absorbs 10 total damage and has a cooldown period afterwards. And I personally view this perk as a trap. Some other wizards like taking it when they're doing, for example, like naked or no gear runs to keep their survivability up just a tad bit more, but it often suffers from the previous point of it only activates when you take damage, so it protects you from the second hit. Most of the time if you get hit with no gear, you lose a majority of your HP anyway, so you're still going to die with a second hit, so I find this to be kind of pointless to take. Up to you. Next, we have Quick Chant. It increases your spellcasting speed by 20%. This perk is massive and is equivalent to having an additional 4 knowledge on your gear. Absolutely take this. I take this as the first perk whenever I'm level 1, and I refuse to unspec it from any build that I participate with. Next, we have Melt. If you deal magical fire damage to a target, the target's physical reduction bonus is reduced by 10% for 5 seconds. Realistically, you won't be doing substantial physical damage in most cases anyway, unless you're doing a Crystal Sword focus build, where you're constantly trying to get into melee, but even then, you'd still benefit from other perks. I can see an argument being used for using this in group play, but you're better off just using perks that give you more damage to take them out faster anyway. Next, we have Mana Surge. Increases your magic damage bonus by 5%. Straight up increased damage. I typically always take this one, as it stacks with the other damage bonuses. And last, we have Sage. Increases knowledge by 10%. This is a bad perk, even with a lot of knowledge. As we discussed earlier, Quick Chant provides 20% cast speed, which is equivalent to 4 additional knowledge. So just to be better than Quick Chant, you'd need a total of 50 knowledge to get a bonus of 5 knowledge, which is beyond what I even came close to in the playtest. I typically sat between the upper teens and the high 20s, so you'd only get like 1 to 2 knowledge, so there's realistically no point in taking this, and I hope that they change it. That's it for perks, so we'll move on to skills. Skills for wizards is pretty straightforward. You pretty much always are going to take meditation and spell memory. That's it. Unless you're trying out a hipster build using intense focus, which reduces the next spell cast to 0.1 seconds for a cast time, you're pretty much just going to run meditation and spell memory every time. You'd have to give up meditation to run a different skill. So you either 1, won't be able to get your spells back, or 2, you're going to have to bring in a campfire to rest at every time you want your spells back, which is costly to do and it's just tedious. You technically can also take a second spell wheel to bring in another 5 spells, but again, you're giving up the means of regenerating spells, which is crucial for a typical standard success in the dungeon. As a wizard, we have access to a variety of spell focuses and weapons at our disposal. We start with a wizard staff, which acts as a spell focus and a melee weapon. Has a speed penalty of -20 when equipped. Overall, it's pretty average, and the spell will originate from the center of your crosshair. I typically will use it whenever I start out, until I find some other option that we'll be going over now. Next, we have the Spellbook. Spell focus only, and has a -10 movement speed when equipped, and casts spells from your right hand, which makes doing left-handed peeks harder, and right-handed peeks a bit easier. You'll have to be careful when casting a spell, trying to strafe left past a corner to make sure you actually strafe far enough so that the spell doesn't blow up in your face. Overall, the Spellbook is my personal favorite, and I always try to run at least a Spellbook in my raids. Next up, we have the Crystal Ball plus the Rondel Dagger. In the most recent playtest, this was the spicy wizard meta to use, with a -25 movement speed from the ball, and -10 from the dagger, making this the slowest movement speed, but also benefits the most from the hybrid style play of melee and magic. The spell casting originates from the orb on your left hand, so it's opposite of the spellbook for the pros and cons, when we were talking about strafing in order to not blow up in your face from earlier. For Ignite, The spell is actually a flat additional magic damage to melee hits, so the faster attacking dagger is more beneficial than using something like the next item. Lastly, for spell focuses, we have the Crystal Sword with a movement speed penalty of -30, but it has physical and magic damage scaling for melee hits. If your spell focus collides with terrain before you actually finish casting the spell, it'll cancel, which makes the sword and staff harder to use in tight spaces fluidly. Personally, this is my favorite aesthetic piece of wizard gear, and if I have one, I'll always have it in my offhand alongside a spellbook. Alright, so you've heard me talk about knowledge a bit, but let's take a bigger bite and go over what the attributes in Dark and Darker actually do. This is going to be the simplified version. If you want the detailed version, there'll be a Google Doc in the description with threshold tables and things like that, but otherwise let's continue. Knowledge gives us access to more spells and increases cast speed by 5% for each point, including meditation. Willpower increases our damage, increases our magic resistance, and increases our buff and debuff durations for spells. So things like haste, ignite, invisibility, those will last longer. Strength increases our physical power and our max HP. It starts off giving us more HP, and then as we get more and more strength, it'll give us a little bit less and less. You can look in the Google Doc for those values there. Agility increases our movement speed. The general rule of thumb is 3 agility is 1 more movement speed. And then agility will also affect our interaction speed and our equip speed. Lastly, we have resourcefulness, which is pretty much only for increasing interaction speed. Things like opening doors or interacting with chests. In the future, it's intended to provide additional backpack slots as like the current running theory, but as of now, it's not implemented. Now that we know what stats do, let's talk about some examples of gear we would want to wear. Pretty much anything with flat additional magic damage or additional true magic damage, any additional knowledge or willpower or just all attributes will be our most desired stats on our gear because it provides us with the most benefits just numbers wise. Secondary, any percentage increases of magic damage, percentage increases of magic penetration, or various defenses like more magic resistance, health, and armor are nice add-ons. If you want to hit things harder, for example with the Rondel Dagger or the Crystal Sword build if you're being a Giga Chad, you can prioritize things like additional physical power, flat physical damage, or true physical damage alongside magic bonuses just to go along with it if you would like to do that kind of build. I personally would prioritize attributes for wizards in the order like so. Knowledge first, then willpower, then agility, then strength, and then resourcefulness. So if you ever are looking at a piece of gear and it has, for example, 2 knowledge versus 2 willpower, I would take the gear with 2 knowledge. Now that we have information, let's go over application. In this case, combat. We'll split this into different phases and talk about things separately. Before we get into decision-making process, I need to go over the standard pre-fight buffing so I can refer to it later. If I say pre-buff, what I mean is using any type of blue protection potion to provide us with a temporary physical damage shield, and then buffing ourselves and or allies with any support spells we have like haste and or ignite. Applying invis to either ourselves or our frontliner, and then pre-selecting our PvP spell of choice. Preparation phase. Before any fight, we want to think through this feedback loop. Is the enemy on top of us or have they ambushed us? If yes, skip the pre-fight buffing and focus on outputting damage to either scare off the enemy or just outright kill them. If no, start your pre-buffs behind cover if they have ranged, and then engage the enemy. If you're in a group and have a frontliner protecting you, you may also find it better to buff your allies even if the enemy is already danger close. Action phase. Once you're engaged with an enemy, different situations can happen. 1. You're winning. Through skill and or gear, you may have killed or heavily damaged the enemy in a short time. You want to maintain awareness of your resources. Am I low on HP? Am I low on spells? If I give chase and a third party shows up, will I be in danger? If everything is good to go, keep chasing and finish them off. Otherwise, reassess. Neutral. No one has had the upper hand and it's a back and forth and it's an extended fight. You want to maintain awareness of your buff durations and reapply them to either yourself and or allies as the need arises. If you haste yourself once at the start of a solo, and then it runs out and they catch you, it can mean death. So maintaining uptime on buffs during delayed conflicts is paramount for your survival. Or losing. You get ambushed, or they land solid hits and it puts you at a disadvantage. As a wizard, we're quite squishy, so don't ego 3-mans as a solo. If we take heavy damage, we want to be applying haste and or invis alongside popping a health pot as we retreat to try to mitigate the disadvantage and turn the tides. If you're low on spells from a previous fight, it's best to escape, find a spot to meditate, than trying to start bonking heads with a starter wizard staff. Trust me. Optimal healing. The fastest way to heal in Dark and Darker is to, first, drink your strongest healing potion and then optionally drink a different value healing potion, as different value potions can be active at the same time. And then second, bandaging while the healing potion is ticking, and then returning to step 1 whenever the potion runs out if you're still low on HP. If you're mid-combat, the best option would be to apply a protection potion before this healing loop, as it provides instant temporary HP in the event that you don't actually have time to get bandages and things like that off. Next, we have movement. Spacing is crucial to master as a wizard, and if you lack in this department, you can have all the damage in the world and you'll still get killed. You want to be utilizing haste and or invis, or slow, to maintain proper distance according to the enemy types. For melee classes, you want to maintain about a mid-range distance to make it easier to land spells while staying outside of their weapon's reach. Feel free to turn away and put your weapon away when they get too close to get that extra boost of speed to get you back where you need to be. For ranged classes, we want to get as close as possible to make it harder for them to aim properly. If you're strafing right next to a ranger, it's going to be really difficult for them to land those headshots. If you know a hit is incoming, there are still things that you can do to mitigate the damage. In Dark and Darker, we have regions on our body that apply different damage multipliers. If you're familiar with Tarkov, you already kind of understand where I'm going here. Head shot damage does the most, torso normal damage, and limbs being a lower multiplier. So if you turn your body and or jump, you can force enemy hits to go from headshots to torso, or torso to limb shots, and you'll keep your squishy body in the game for longer. Next up, map knowledge. Being in the dungeon might feel like a labyrinth when you're not familiar with the map layout. You could retreat from PvP in one room, find yourself in the next room just filled with skeleton archers, and they take you out the moment you dare get within their vision. Taking the time to familiarize yourself with the map, where enemies are located, possible ways to reposition, will greatly increase your survival rate in the dungeons to come. And if you're interested, the Dark and Darker developers actually post the map pictures in their Discord, so feel free to go and check those out. Next, we'll cover some PvE. Fighting hordes of monsters as a wizard can feel polarizing at times for those uninitiated. You blow all your spells and quickly gun down the first few and then sit on the floor, waiting for your spells to come back. For the next minute, just staring at the wall. It can make it feel slow. But let me tell you that the wizard is anything but slow at clearing mobs, and we just have to be efficient about things. First, we want to make sure that we're always aiming to headshot with our spells and our melee strikes, especially whenever we're using magic missile. 2, if you've ever played COD Zombies, you might be familiar with training groups of enemies. For those who aren't, we're essentially wanting to aggro multiple enemies and then walk in small circles to group them up together. That way, we can either use things like Fireball to hit all the enemies at once, or put Ignite on a melee weapon and just drag our weapon through multiple enemies to get multiple hits per one swing. You don't want to burn all your spells on fighting mobs and leave yourself drained if a player were to show up. So if you burn a couple spells and there's still some mobs left, I would recommend switching to melee, or find a place to rest and get some spells back so you're always ready for that fight. Alright, so that's going to be a wrap on the Wizard Guide. If you got any useful information from the video, please leave a like on this video below. And if you want to see more content from me in the future, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss another video. Cheers.